Hello, History of Sexuality students. This is Professor Bowen here with my Week 2 comments video. We had some really great conversations in class last week, and I wanted to take some time to address a few of the many questions and comments that came out of these. In particular, I wanted to shed more light on the whole essentialist constructionist controversy, to clarify some things about David Halpern's article, Is There a History of Sexuality? And to respond to all of your excellent points about the Eurocentric aspects of this field. So let's start with the last of these points. As almost all of you observed, the history of sexuality has, unfortunately, been a field largely centered in Western Europe and North America. As a result of this, many of the categories, concepts, identities, and labels that historians use when talking about this subject come from Euro-American contexts. And this is a problem, particularly when those ideas are used to study other parts of the world. As some of you pointed out, among other things, this leads to a situation where sexual customs that differ from those seen in the West get identified, consciously or not, as different, or even worse, as abnormal. It also leads to the unfortunate assumption that the kinds of sexuality seen in Western culture are similar to those outside the West. Can we use terms like gay, straight, or bi when discussing sexuality in Zimbabwe, Iran, or China? And why are there so few studies of sexuality in the Middle East, in the countries of the former Soviet Union, South and East Asia, and Africa? These are all excellent questions, and fortunately, historians have of late begun to grapple with them. In addition to people like Damir Ishakov, there are scholars like Howard Chiang, one of the foremost students of the history of sexuality in China, Afsana Najmabadi, the premier sexuality and gender scholar in the field of Iranian history, Saheed Adarinto, one of the most prolific writers on the history of Nigerian sexuality, Liat Kozma, who writes about sexuality in Egypt and the Levant, Khaled El-Ruhaib, the author of Before Homosexuality in the Arab Islamic World, parts of which we will read later in the semester, and Ashwini Tambe, who has published a number of excellent books and articles dealing with sexuality in colonial and post-colonial India. In addition to these works, recent years have seen the publication of edited volumes with titles like Decentering Western Sexualities, which includes chapters on Romania, Slovenia, Poland, and Macedonia, and another book called A Global History of Sexual Science, which moves the discussion of sexology into hitherto unknown locales like Russia, Japan, Korea, and China. Of course, there's still lots to be done in this regard. For example, we still don't have any book-length treatments of the history of sexuality in Kazakhstan, or any Central Asian country as far as I know. But slowly, this field is growing out of its Eurocentric roots, and that's a very good thing. Okay, next I wanted to talk for just a bit about essentialism and constructionism. I think we all basically understand the differences between these, and we all correctly characterized David Halpern as a constructionist. But we're going to return to these concepts regularly throughout the semester, and just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I thought it would help to provide some additional clarification, specifically on what we mean when we talk about the social construction of sexuality. The basic point in constructionism is this. Sexuality is not a thing that can be found in all times and places. Instead, it is something created by the cultural discourses of particular societies. This is a very counterintuitive claim, because it goes against many of our core assumptions about sexuality. We tend to think that in every society there are specific kinds of people, some gay, some straight, and some of other orientations. We think of sexuality in terms of orientations and predispositions, something determined by our genes or other biological phenomena. If you have doubts as to how popular the essentialist viewpoint is, do a quick Google search for lists of famous gay people in history. These lists illustrate the popularity of the essentialist understanding of sexuality. But constructionism challenges this understanding. While it is a fairly unpopular view outside of academic settings, it forms the foundation for almost all social sciences and humanities scholarship on sexuality as well as on lots of other things. The basic premise of constructionism, to rephrase what I just said, is that the categories that we use to think about and define ourselves sexually are not timeless universal truths, but instead things that societies create. There are two basic degrees of constructionism, one that we might call moderate and the other that we might call strong. The moderate position is simply that the meanings people ascribe to sexual behaviors or desires vary from culture to culture, and that because of this, we can't assume that the categories we use to organize sexuality today were the same ones that our ancestors used. To give an example, whereas the essentialist would say that someone who has sex with both men and women is bisexual, the constructionist would say that we can't automatically assume this, that the way that sexual identities are formed is different in different times and places. That's what we would call moderate constructionism. The strong version of this goes further. In addition to saying that sexual categories change from age to age and from place to place, it says that the very notion of sexuality as a way of classifying someone's identity is a socio-historical construct. The strong constructionist would say that while people in the past surely had sexual preferences and likes and dislikes, none of these things defined them as a particular kind of person. That is what Halperin means when he says that ancient Greeks lacked sexuality. It's not that sexual desire was alien to them or that they had no system for assigning meaning to sex. It's that they didn't identify themselves as sexual beings in the way that we do today. In other words, what he's saying is that the whole concept of sexual orientation was foreign to the peoples of antiquity. People didn't define themselves in terms of who they were sexually attracted to or in terms of who they slept with. What governed the way that people thought about these things was not sexuality, but instead gender. To the extent that ancient Greeks had sexualities, they were based on gender roles, not sexual orientation. And here, the key gender formulation was this: to be a man was to be the active, penetrating partner. To be a woman was to be the passive, penetrated partner. Under this schematic, anyone who penetrated, regardless of who they penetrated, was a man. Even women who penetrated were thought to be men. Now, it does not take much thought, I think, to see how different this is than our modern way of making meaning out of sex. Since the late 1800s, we have lived in a world that says if a man penetrates another man, he is gay. And modern societies have for a long time defined this behavior as a kind of deviance. But in ancient Greece, not so. In ancient Greece, the man who penetrated another man was not a deviant of any kind. A free adult Greek male could legitimately desire any social inferior, a slave, a youth, his wife, or another woman. All of these relationships were socially sanctioned. Only the penetrated male was thought to be deviant, and their deviance was not of a sexual nature. Instead, a penetrated male was understood to be a form of gender deviance. And the same applied to women. The woman who took the active sexual role was seen as mannish and deviant because of her transgressive gender performance. Her partner was seen as completely normal, though. She occupied a submissive, passive, conventionally feminine place in their relationship. Obviously, this is worlds from where we are today. Today, it is our object choice that matters, not our gender role. In ancient Greece, says Halperin, it was the opposite. To be the passive partner in a relationship was to, quote, have a woman's experience, as one writer put it, or as another said, to be penetrated was, quote, to suffer womanly things. But here is the basic point. Ancient Greeks did not really have strong preferences for sex with one gender over the other. They did not identify as having a sexual orientation. We could say that whereas today we live in a sexual culture dominated by the homo-hetero-binary, in ancient Greece, their sexual culture was dominated by the active-passive binary. And that binary was a function of gender. That's what Halperin is saying. He's saying that when we look at the ancient world, it's clear that the very idea of sexuality was non-existent. Instead of being natural, biological, and universal, it was something that societies, much later on, he says, birthed into existence. That's what makes Halperin a strong constructionist. Okay, so this brings us to the figure of the Malus, or as he was sometimes referred to as the Knidos. These were terms of abuse. They were used to chastise and to ridicule. And they were sometimes used to describe men who chose to be penetrated. That is, men who actively desired the passive sexual role. Because of this, some commentators translate these terms as, quote-unquote, passive homosexual. But this is problematic. It would be better to understand Malus and Knidos as terms used to describe someone who violated gender etiquette, not as a member of a specific sexuality. And why? Well, because, for one, it was not only men who were described as such. The Roman poet Catullus, for example, refers to a female prostitute as Cnidor, literally Knidos-like. On a more basic level, these terms meant woman, that is, someone who adopted feminine modes of speech, dress, and walk. The Malus was soft, someone who liked warm baths and delicate clothing and perfumes. In other words, while words like Malus and Knidos were taken to signify effeminacy, that did not automatically imply same-sex sexual desire. These men were not proto-homosexuals. They were characterized by gender deviance, not by a specific sexual practice or preference. Indeed, some of those attacked as effeminate were clearly men trying to attract women. Men accused of being a Knidos were actually sometimes accused of adultery, which indicates that this was not the same as either homosexuality or heterosexuality. Effeminacy, in other words, was flexible. It could imply same-sex sexual desire or refute it. All right, I think that's where I'm going to leave things for now. Hopefully this clarifies some of the things you've been wondering about from last week's readings. If not, well, please know that next week we're going to take an even closer look at ancient Greece. So this should give you an opportunity to understand things a bit more clearly, or at the very least to ask some more great questions. Thanks for watching this video. If you have any other questions or comments, please feel free to get in touch in any way that works for you. I'm looking forward to our next week of the semester, and I'll see you all soon in our virtual classroom. Bye-bye.